This is chapter 1 of Ronald Kowalski's book, The Bolshevik the Bolshevik Party in Conflict, the Left Communist Opposition of 1918. The first chapter is titled The Rise and Fall of the Left Communist Movement. The first portents that the question of peace or war would prove to be a source of bitter controversy within the Bolshevik Party emerged in November 1917. The failure of the decree on peace of the 26th of October, which called for a general democratic peace, to evoke any response impelled the Soviet government to initiate negotiations for an armistice with Germany on the 14th of November. In response, an influential group in the powerful Petersburg Committee, led by G.E. Evdokimov and E.A.G. Fenigstein, Doleski, V.N. Narchuk, and Karl Radek, opposed the idea of peace treaties with any of the imperialist states, calling instead for an international civil war against world capitalism. Sorry, I gotta get to the end notes. Let me see. Okay. I probably won't be reading too many footnotes because a lot of them are in Russian. So anyway, sorry about that. A week after the armistice came into force, negotiations with the Germans for peace began at Brest-Litovsk on the 3rd of December, with Adolf Joffe leading the Soviet delegation, suspended on the 15th of December, apparently on the Bolshevik suggestion, to allow time for the Allied powers to enter into them and so conclude a general peace. They were renewed on the 27th of December. Leon Trotsky now headed the Soviet mission, with the task of dragging out the talks in the belief that world revolution would soon intervene and render the need for a separate peace redundant. It was at this point that the left communists coalesced as a distinct faction, previously having only made separate statements condemning the Soviet government's conduct of foreign policy. On the 28th of December, Nikolai Osinsky, V.V. Obolensky, which is his name, A. Lomov, or G.I. Opakov, and Ino Kenty Stukov issued a resolution adopted the same day by a plenary session of the Moscow Regional (Oblast) Bureau, the organizational center of left communism, according to Z.L. Serebriakova. It demanded an end to negotiations with Imperial Germany and the rupture of all relations with the other imperialist, quote, robber states. Instead, Soviet Russia must declare a revolutionary war against world imperialism. Previously, even Lenin had concurred with this policy, Osinsky claimed, insisting that he was doing no more than defending, quote, Lenin's old position, end quote. On the same day, F.N. Dingelstedt recalled, the Petersburg Committee, goaded by Fenigstein, S.N. Ravitch, and V. Volodarsky, M.M. Goldstein, and others, came out in support of this policy, the so-called, quote, Moscow point of view, end quote. Soon many leading Bolsheviks, including the cream of the party intelligentsia, rallied in support of revolutionary war. Yet the left communist movement was not just one of disgruntled intellectuals, isolated from and unrepresentative of the views of the rank and file throughout the country, as Lenin's polemic on occasion implied. On the contrary, throughout January and February, widespread opposition to peace existed in the lower reaches of the party and beyond. A majority of local party organizations, and local Soviets too, in which the Mensheviks and SRs added their voices to those of the dissenting Bolsheviks, opposed separate peace with Imperial Germany. Quote, most town committees and nearly all regional committees, end quote, Robert Service has argued, quote, were sternly declaring that revolutionary war was the only possible option for the party if the truce should break down, ... End quote. Moscow and Petersburg were cases in point. The leading party organizations in Moscow, the Regional Bureau, the District, Okrug Committee, and the City Committee, consistently opposed the continuation of negotiations for peace with the Germans. Footnote: a full analysis of the rise and fall of the left communist movement in Moscow, as in the Ukraine and the Urals, will be developed in Chapter 7 below. End footnote. The Petersburg Committee adopted the same position, endorsed by the majority of party activists at a meeting on the 18th of January. The renewed German offensive on the 18th of February, 8 days after the negotiations at Brest had broken down, when Trotsky declared that Russia would neither continue the war nor sign peace on German terms, certainly raised doubts in the minds of many in the capital about the feasibility of waging revolutionary war. On the 21st of February, the majority Bolshevik fraction of the Petrograd Soviet, with apparently only 4 dissenting voices, changed tack to support the decision of the Council of People's Commissars, Sovnarkom, to accept peace on German terms. Footnote: the Central Committee of the Metal Workers' Union shared similar misgivings about revolutionary war. End footnote. However, at the grassroots across the city, militancy, it would seem, continued to prevail. In face of the dire threat posed by the German advance, many district (rayon) Soviets, as well as individual factories and plants, passed resolutions in favor of revolutionary war. They echoed the despairing plea of the Okhta District Soviet, which proclaimed that it was preferable to die fighting for international socialism than to wait to be crushed by the forces of international imperialism. Footnote. Oh, never mind. No footnote. At this time, words appear to have been matched by deeds, as many Bolsheviks and ordinary workers mobilized to defend the capital, 500 from the Volkin and 600 from the Sestroretsk works, all those under the age of 50 from the Baltic shipyard, 200 from the Second City District, and 3,000 from Vyborg. In all, David Mandel concludes that in the final days of February, 10,000 volunteered for the Red Army, others joined the Red Guards, while additional workers' detachments were set up. Footnote: see David Mandel's The Petrograd Workers and the Soviet Seizure of Power, 1984, and D. Fedotov White, The Growth of the Red Army, published in 1944, confirms that a readiness to fight to defend the revolution did exist, at least till the 1st of March, by which time he reckons that 15,300 volunteers had come forward in Petrograd. The Fourth City Conference of the party, which reconvened on the 1st of March after adjourning in face of the emergency precipitated by the German advance, reflected these sentiments. Delegates from the districts, with the exception of Vyborg, which is split on the issue, were reported to have opposed any fresh overtures to the Germans. Other major towns in North Russia, such as Archangel, Murmansk, Novgorod, and Vologda, followed the lead given by the two capitals, as did the naval base of Kronstadt, where, according to Israel Getzler, it was the left SRs who were chiefly instrumental in raising opposition to a separate peace. A similar pattern was to be found in the Volga region, urged on in particular by VP Antonov Saratovsky, I. Vardin Mgaladze, and M.V. Vasilev, chairman of the Bolshevik City Committee, both the leading party organizations in the Bolshevik-dominated city, and provincial Soviets in Saratov repeatedly rejected separate peace with Germany. Meetings of the party rank and file and other workers' organizations, but not the peasants, from January until late February and early March, consistently endorsed this position, lending credence to the claim of Vardin Mgaladze the delegate from Saratov at the 17th Extraordinary Party Congress, and the majority of workers remained opposed to peace. Counter to the decision of this Congress, on the 9th of March, the Executive Committee of the Saratov Soviet mandated its delegates to the forthcoming Fourth All-Russian Congress of Soviets to resist ratification of the Brest Peace. A comparable correlation of forces existed in Samara. Leading party organs and much of the rank and file supported the left communists. The executive committees of the city and provincial Soviets, then dominated by the left communists, also mandated their delegates to the Fourth Congress of Soviets, Kuzmin and Kazakov from the provincial Soviet, and Valerian Kuibyshev and I. Kraniukov from the city, to reject ratification of the peace. The situation was mirrored elsewhere in the region. In fact, in February, all the provincial Soviets in the region had adopted a left communist position, although at the Uzd and Volos level. So, V.I. Tikachev has recently claimed, support for the Revolutionary War appears to have been much less certain. In the first half of March, hostility to peace remained widespread, both in the party and the Soviets in Astrakhan, Penza, Simbirsk, and Tsaritsyn. There's a footnote that I missed that says, Kuibyshev and Kraniukov signed the declaration of the left communists of the Congress, but there appears to be no record of what Kuzmin and Kazakov did. Kuibyshev also had been the delegate of the provincial party organization at the 7th Party Congress, where he claimed a majority for revolutionary war in the Samara Party. End footnote. Further east in the Urals and beyond, the left communists also gained considerable support. Siberia was a case in point. The West Siberian Regional Congress of Soviets, on the 19th of January, the Second Congress of Soviets of Siberia, which met in Irkutsk, to the last week of February, the First Siberian Peasants' Congress on the 1st of March, the Krasnoyarsk Party, which, in the opinion of Russell Snow, was the strongest bastion of left communism in the region, and the Soviets in Enisysk, Khabarovsk, Omsk, Vladivostok, all opposed negotiations with Germany in the belief that only the struggle for international revolution could secure a lasting peace. Moreover, left communist sympathizers who dominated the Far Eastern Regional Bureau of the party, so Paul Dotsenko has alleged, appeared to have been prepared to split Siberia from the Russian Republic should the latter consent to peace. Footnote. See P. Dotsenko, The Struggle for Democracy in Siberia, 1917 to 1921. Russell Snow, The Bolsheviks in Siberia, 1917 to 1918, where Snow also isolates Krasnoyarsk as a bastion of left Bolsheviks during 1917. End footnote. On the 22nd of March, after the Fourth Congress of the Soviets had voted to ratify the peace, the Executive Committee of the Siberian Soviet continued to refuse to countenance this course of action, while the, quote, Siberian Council of People's Commissars even declared itself still at war with the Central Powers, end quote. Footnote. See Oscar Onweiler, The Soviets, the Russian Workers', Peasants, and Soldiers' Councils, 1905 to 1921. End footnote. Finally, left communist strength was also pronounced in the Urals itself in the winter of 1918, as it was in the south of the country in Kursk, and especially in the Ukraine and the Donbass. Only in the west of the country, in provinces such as Vitebsk and Smolensk, most immediately threatened by the renewed German offensive, and within the Western Regional Committee, did support for peace at virtually any price rapidly swell in the last third of February. Even here, however, instances of grassroots militancy in face of German depredations were reported, but they appear to have been largely ineffectual in checking the advance. Local Soviet responses to the Central Executive Committee's CEC circular of the 26th of February, speaking to determine their position on the Brest peace, appeared to confirm the extent of opposition to peace. Lenin himself conceded that of the 200 replies received in the first 10 days of March, a small majority, 105 to 95, favored revolutionary war. The left communists gleefully exploited these results for their own factional ends. In the first issue of the journal Communist, the daily newspaper issued by the left-dominated Petersburg Committee and Petersburg District Committee to mobilize popular support for revolutionary war, Lomov argued that the responses to date confirmed the left's contention that major proletarian centers of the country remained opposed to separate peace on German terms. With the partial exceptions of Petrograd and Sevastopol, he continued, pressure for peace had come mainly from peasant-dominated Volosht and Uzd Soviets. So bearing out the left's repeated assertion that Lenin and his faction had abandoned revolutionary war in response to reactionary peasant aspirations. Evidently, the renewed German offensive had not produced a complete collapse of the will to resist. In fact, the German ultimatum of the 23rd of February contained even harsher terms for peace than previously. In addition to Poland, Lithuania, Western Latvia, and the Moon Sound Islands, Russia was now to surrender Eastern Latvia. Finland and the Ukraine provided for a time a stiffening of resolve across Russia to fight. As even Lenin admitted, quote, from everywhere, bracket, it generated, and bracket, a readiness to rise in defense of Soviet power and to fight to the last man, end quote. Lenin. Yet enthusiasm itself, Lenin hastened to add, without an organized and equipped army, was totally incapable of halting the German juggernaut. Convinced of Soviet Russia's military exhaustion, of its inability to defend itself effectively, Lenin uncompromisingly resisted all pressures to continue the war, however widespread they seemed to be. Lenin's intransigence threatened to split the party, at least at its highest levels. At the session of the Central Committee, CC, held on the 23rd of February, when the revised German peace terms were communicated to its members, Lenin threatened to resign if, quote, the policy of revolutionary phrase-making, end quote, as he derisively termed it, did not cease at once. The left communist diehards on the CC, Andrei Bubnov, Bukharin, Lomov, Mosai Uritsky, were equally unyielding in their opposition to acceptance of peace, with Lomov sanguinely predicting that further resistance was, quote, certain, bracket, to cause, end bracket, demoralization among the German troops, end quote, and so halt their advance. Yet the real state of affairs, the continuing absence of revolution within Germany, and the rapid disintegration of Russian forces at the front, undermined their position and produced a realignment within the Central Committee. Trotsky now abandoned his obdurate opposition to peace, arguing that the deep divisions in the party precluded the possibility of successfully waging revolutionary war in any shape or form. Yet, still unable to steel himself to vote for peace, Trotsky abstained, as did Felix Dzerzhinsky, Joffa, and Nikolai Krestinsky, who shared Trotsky's point of view. Their abstentions, however, enabled Lenin, with the support of Ivan Smilga, Grigory Sokolnikov, Joseph Stalin, Elena Stasova, Yakov Sverdlov, and Grigory Zinoviev, to gain a majority in favor of peace when the question was put to the vote. This decision in turn provoked the resignation of Bukharin and Bukharin's co-thinkers from all positions of responsibility in the party and government, with the added threat that they would campaign openly against peace. After an all-night session on the 23rd to the 4th of February, the CEC was won around to accept the now more punitive peace terms offered by the Germans. Footnote: in the CEC, 116 votes were cast in favor of peace, 85 against, with 25 abstentions. End footnote. In early March, despite an intense grassroots campaign of opposition to Lenin's policy, the tide clearly turned against the left communists. At lower levels within the party and Soviets, sympathy for revolutionary war rapidly began to erode. This was soon apparent in the capitals. In Moscow, the Soviet, closely followed by a city conference of the party, overwhelmingly adopted resolutions in favor of peace on the 3rd and 4th of March. In Petrograd, too, the groundswell of militancy evident across the city in the last week of February began to disintegrate in early March. The left communists themselves grudgingly conceded the erosion of their support amongst the rank and file, alleging, however, that it was in large part the product of the demoralizing impact of the government's peace policy itself, and as well as of the mobilization of the more politically conscious and militant workers to the front. On the 5th of March, the Petrograd Soviet reaffirmed that peace was inevitable, given the unwelcome delay in the outbreak of revolution in Europe and Russia's own military and economic weakness. Bolshevik organizations in the first and second city, the Moscow, Vyborg, and Vasilevsky districts, soon followed suit, as did the Petersburg District Committee. Aware of these realignments, the left-dominated Petersburg Committee convened an extraordinary city conference of the party to ascertain precisely what the attitudes of the rank and file in the city were. When it met on the 20th of March, the answer was clear. The left communists lost their majority on the Petersburg Committee, with only the Narva district continuing to support them. Moreover, Communist was condemned for its splitting tactics and closed down. Even more tellingly, at the session of the 7th Party Congress held on the 7th of March, Radek candidly admitted that, quote, now we, bracket, left communists, end bracket, are the minority, end quote. By mid-March, when delegates to the Fourth All-Russian Congress of Soviets gathered in Moscow, his assessment of the situation was apparently confirmed. At the Bolshevik caucus preceding the Congress, they could only muster 38 votes in support of revolutionary war, against 453 in favor of accepting the Brest Peace. Footnote: Izvestia Moskvy, 14th of March 1918, reported only 36 voted for the left communist position. At the Congress itself, of the 814 Bolshevik delegates present, only 65 refused to sanction ratification of the peace, but, rather than split the party by voting against it, they abstained. See Appendix B. Arguably, these figures exaggerate the decline of the left communist movement. The reports of delegates to the Fourth Congress of Soviets suggest that in some regions support for peace was still far from assured. In the Volga region, particularly in Saratov, many doubted if the Brest Peace would in fact provide Russia with any respite in which to recover, and then to proceed with the construction of socialism. Substantial left communist enclaves also continued to exist in Simbirsk and Samara within both the party and the Soviets. In the Urals, too, especially in Perm province, support for the revolutionary partisan war remained strong, but it was from the south most of all that voices in favor of continued resistance were to be heard most vociferously. From the provinces of the Poltava and Taurida, from the city of Sevastopol, where there appears to have been a dramatic change of mood, and from the Donbass. There, where there had been no lull in the war, the continuing advance of the Germans threatened all the gains that the workers and peasants had made during the revolution. Even the Don Cossacks, fearful of German intentions, were reportedly ready to wage a partisan war. For their part, the left communists in the South tried to capitalize on this sympathy for their position by attempting to unite these disparate forces into a single military organization, which would be better able to resist the Germans. In late March and early April, S.I. Sirtsov and his fellow thinkers in the Don Soviet Republic won considerable support for the idea of a military union with what remained of Soviet power in the Ukraine. This plan, however, came to naught. At the Congress of Soviets of the Don Republic, which convened in Rostov on the 9th of April, Lenin's allies, afraid that such a union would provide the Germans with a casus belli for a fresh assault on the Russian Republic, thwarted this scheme. Under the leadership of Sergei Ordzhonikidze, they secured a sizable majority for ratification of the Brest Peace. And if you don't know who Sergei Ordzhonikidze is, he was like a good friend of Stalin, who I think helped... who was part of Stalin's, with Lenin's approval, invasion of Georgia in, I don't know if it was 1920. I'm not sure. These reservations notwithstanding, it seems clear that soon after the renewed German offensive, the left communists in the main were fighting a losing battle on the question of peace or revolutionary war. Three factors appear to have been primarily responsible for their defeat. First, and in Service's view, most important, Soviet Russia's inability effectively to resist the advancing German forces made Lenin's ruthless and insistent logic that there was no alternative but to sign the peace appear more and more irrefutable, as the rank and file within the party and the Soviets increasingly realized. Second, Lenin and Lenin's lieutenants conducted their own grassroots campaign of agitation and persuasion, most vociferously in Petrograd and Moscow, to persuade the rank and file of the rectitude of their policy. Third, the machinations of Sverdlov, the Central Committee secretary, and, according to Leonard Shapiro, quote, the main power behind the party organization, end quote, ensured that Lenin's supporters were in a majority at the Seventh Party Congress. Provincial organizations opposed to peace were deliberately underrepresented. At the Fourth Congress of Soviets, his manipulation of procedures, as I.U.O. Martov caustically remarked, combined with his emphasis on party discipline, facilitated ratification of the peace there. See Service, Bolshevik Party, pages 80 to 82. See Duval's article, Yakov Mikhailovich Sverdlov, founder of the Bolshevik Party machine, published in R.C. Elwood, its edited volume, Reconsiderations on the Russian Revolution. Leonard Shapiro's The Communist Party of the Soviet Union, published in 1970. And see Ochet, page 30, for a similar critique of Sverdlov from the social revolutionary Ilin. Even after the defeat on the issue of peace, the left, or quote, proletarian communists as they increasingly call themselves, did not disband. However, with the ratification of the Brest-Litovsk Treaty, the focus of their opposition shifted. While continuing to carpet the foreign policy of the dominant Leninist faction, and even to revive the call for revolutionary war in May, after the Germans had installed the reactionary Skoropadsky regime in the Ukraine, the burden of their attack was directed against what they perceived to be Lenin's compromises and retreats in internal policy. Where the hell am I? At the beginning of 1918, in January and February, they had castigated Lenin for his willingness to appease the peasants by sanctioning the division of land amongst them. Similar critique to Rosa Luxemburg had. Not only was such a policy contrary to the demands of socialism, but potentially fatal to it. The peace itself had been in large part another concession to peasant pressure. If continued, this path of conciliation would have grave consequences, leading to, quote, the political supremacy of the semi-proletarian, petty bourgeois masses, and proved to be only a transitional stage to the complete domination of finance capital, end quote. In the spring, they repeatedly asserted that evidence of such degeneration towards state capitalism was at hand, manifest in Lenin's willingness to collaborate with the remaining capitalists as a means of restoring Soviet Russia's fast disintegrating industrial base. Parallel and quite consistent with this development, Soviet democracy, conceived in terms of a, quote, commune state, a quote, commune state, end quote, ruled from below, end quote, was increasingly being supplanted by an authoritarian, centralized, bureaucratic state. Footnote, Osinski had argued in a prophetically similar vein during a session of the Central Committee on the 21st of January. 14th of March 1918. Communist, 14th of March 1918, contains a version of the theses that he presented then. Karl Radek. See Karl Radek's article, Communist, something in Russian. The conflicts over agriculture, industry, and state are discussed fully in chapters 4, 5, and 6 below. End footnote. At a meeting with Lenin and his faction on the 4th of April, Osinski presented their theses on the current situation, in which these concerns were articulated fully. Subsequently, the theses were published in a new, short-lived theoretical journal named, like its predecessor, Communist, edited by Bukharin, Osinski, Radek, and Vladimir Smirnov. Published under the aegis of the Moscow Regional Bureau until they lost control of it at the 4th Moscow Regional Conference held between the 14th and the 17th of May, it was composed largely of a series of polemical articles debunking the domestic policies then defended by Lenin and the majority of the party and sketching out their own, more radical program for the construction of socialism. During this phase of their opposition, the left communists continued to garner some grassroots support for their views. Never as extensive as in the debate over peace, it remained limited almost exclusively to the Moscow region, the Ukraine and the Urals, as well as Krasnoyarsk. They also found some support within the Sovnarkov structure, from where they opposed, in particular, Lenin's program for industrial reconstruction. Footnote: see essay Oppenheimer's essay, the Supreme Economic Council, 1917 to 1921. And footnote. Yet by the end of May, their bases within the party had been recaptured by Lenin's allies, and as a faction, the left communist movement disappeared, although not without trace. At the end of August, Yevgeny Preobrazhensky attempted, vainly, to win over the regional party committee in the Urals to left communist policies, while at the Second Congress of the Economic Councils in December, as Samuel Oppenheimer has noted, vestigial voices from the left were heard, bitterly criticizing the continued drift to bureaucratic centralization within the economy at the expense of workers' control. The eventual demise of the left communist movement is not reducible to any single or simple cause, such as the failure of its leadership, as Stephen Cohen, amongst others, has suggested. Footnote: see Cohen's Bukharin and W. Lerner's book Karl Radek, where, to be fair, he also concedes that even with strong leadership, quote, the left communists, ... had slender prospects at best, end quote. Lerner. Robert Service, in the book Bolshevik Party, has effectively refuted the notion that a failure of leadership contributed that significantly to the left communist defeat. End footnote. Circumstances within and without Russia in the first half of 1918 militated against its survival. First, its policies rapidly lost credibility. Just as Revolutionary War had come to appear impractical, so too its defense of the commune state, in which economic and political power would be diffused to the local Soviets and other elected workers' organizations, seemed to offer no realistic solution to the chaos gripping the country. In particular, many within the party, the trades unions, and, to a lesser extent, the leadership of the factory plant committees, agree with Lenin that workers' control was exacerbating economic dislocation and had to be curbed if industry was to be revived. His arguments in favor of a return to tried and tested methods of centralized economic control, one-person management, and traditional means of discipline and incentive were gaining ground even before the renewed outbreak of civil war in May, when the very survival of Soviet power ever more insistently demanded the speedy restoration of order in industry to increase the production of war material. To many, Lenin's prescriptions seemed best able to produce such results, while the majority of the left communists were prepared to suspend their opposition in view of the growing military threats to Bolshevik rule. Footnote: see A.G. Shliapnikov's now classic account, Conditions of the Railways Under Workers' Control, published in J. Bunyan and H. Fisher, The Bolshevik Revolution, 1917 to 1918, Documents and Materials, published in Stanford in 1965, See also S.A. Smith's Red Petrograd Revolution in the Factories, 1917 to 1918, and Robert Service's Bolshevik Party. End footnote. Second, in the latter half of May, the Central Committee acted to establish a more rigid form of party discipline, threatened both by the influx of new, politically untempered recruits and by the exodus of many experienced activists to take up administrative positions within the state and economy or to join the newly formed Red Army. Moreover, the overt and strident opposition of the left communist faction, the Central Committee continued, had undermined discipline further. Sverdlov's machinations notwithstanding, hitherto the debate with the left communists had been conducted fairly openly and democratically, even harmoniously. At the session of the Central Committee on the 23rd of February, Lenin had conceded that they had the right to agitate openly against acceptance of the peace. At the Seventh Party Congress, Lenin had referred to them as, quote, our young Moscow friends, end quote, while Pravda called them, quote, our friends from communists, end quote. The critical situation now facing the revolution led to a change in the Central Committee's attitude. Lenin and his allies sought a more compliant party in which all decisions, once taken, were to be implemented without further discussion. Footnote. See Izvestia, 22nd of May, 1918. Ironically, as we shall see in Chapter 6 below, many left communists agreed that all was not well within the party and sought a purge of the, quote, non-proletariat, end quote, elements which had permeated it. End footnote. This requirement appears to have been directed specifically against the left communists, as Varvara Yakovleva implied when she accused the Central Committee of aiming to eliminate independent thought within the party. Indeed, the entire campaign to raise party discipline was used as a stick with which to beat the left communists. Some were expelled, though how many suffered this fate and how crucial such a purge was to their eventual defeat is difficult to gauge with any accuracy. Third, certain changes in policy, when not introduced solely in response to left communist criticisms, may have gone some way to appeasing them. In late April and May, Lenin's hopes of running industry in collaboration with the indigenous capitalists collapsed, to be superseded by a more thorough and extensive nationalization of large-scale industry. By mid-May, Lenin himself was calling for, quote, the most decisive measures against our bourgeoisie, end quote. Footnote. See R.B. Day's Leon Trotsky and the Politics of Economic Isolation, published in 1973. S. Mal's The Economic Organization of War Communism, published in 1985, has argued that left communist criticisms played some part in the eventual failure of Lenin's plans for collaboration with the capitalists. End footnote. Moreover, the worsening food crisis in urban Russia compelled Lenin, so Silvana Male, I'm not sure how to pronounce this person's name. I think they might be Italian, so I think it might be Male, has concluded to sanction an assault on the peasants. Moreover, the worsening food crisis in urban Russia compelled Lenin, so Silvana Male has concluded to sanction an assault on the peasants, in theory only the rich peasants, and to encourage the more rapid establishment of communal agriculture as the left communists had sought. New section. Towards the end of this study, we shall return to re-examine in detail certain regional manifestations of left communism, specifically in Moscow, the Ukraine, and the Urals, to discover if the existing assumptions that they were left communist strongholds are tenable. First, however, it will prove fruitful to return to somewhat more familiar territory and once again to map out the nature of the conflict between Lenin and the left communists, on the issue of peace and war, and on the methods to be employed in the construction of socialism in Russia. The purpose of so doing will emerge in the following chapters, which will seek to demonstrate that while the terrain may be familiar, to date it has been ill-charted. But before a more accurate map can be drawn, it will prove necessary to consider the implications of Bukharin's defense of the left communist position at the Seventh Party Congress. He protested against the accusations leveled at them by Lenin in his article, The Revolutionary Phrase, for instance, and in his speech at the Seventh Party Congress, that carried away by the, quote, triumphal march, of Soviet power, end quote, they had become intoxicated by a youthful romanticism or idealism, which had led them to indulge in an orgy of radical sloganizing, with no regard for the, quote, objective circumstances, end quote, of the moment. On the contrary, Lenin insisted that the reasons for their opposition. On the contrary, Bukharin insisted that the reasons for their opposition to Lenin were, quote, much more profound, end quote. Quote, our disagreements, comrades, are not at all reducible to the fact that some of us stand for a phrase, others for a business-like approach. This is complete nonsense. Our disagreements lie in another plane, in a different evaluation of the international situation, and also, of our internal situation, end quote. Bukharin. The task of the following chapter will be to explore in detail Bukharin's defense, since, as we shall discover, there are good grounds for supposing that the left communists and Lenin did in fact have differing assessments of the prospects for socialist revolution within and without Russia. But to fulfill this objective, it will be necessary first of all to determine the competing theoretical frameworks within which they operated. Such a task requires that we return several years before 1918 to analyze how the Bolsheviks conceptualized the imperialist war in which they lived. The imperialist world in which they lived. That's the end of the chapter. Thanks for listening.